London, 22nd of March last year. Khalid Masood floors the accelerator of his 4x4, mounting the pavement on Westminster Bridge. Watch the highlighted circle. The car was his murder weapon.
This wasn't a random attack. This was an individual who'd been an extremist for many, many years, whose pattern of behaviour over many, many years was characteristic of many Islamist extremists that we see.
Minutes earlier, Masood had sent a document to his WhatsApp messaging group justifying his terrorist attack. It was called Retaliation. Three people were killed outright on the bridge. One died later in hospital. Newsnight has learned it could have been even worse. Security sources have told Newsnight that these barriers saved 25 to 30 lives on the day of the attack, and that's because Khalid Masood's car was forced off the pavement and onto the road at the start of the barriers. He drove along here, then cut back into the pavement at the end of the barriers, crashing the car over there on the left.
Oh my God!
Seconds later, he jumped out of his car armed with two knives, ran down here through a barrier leading to the Palace of Westminster and stabbed PC Palmer. A plainclothes protection officer shot Masood dead, but PC Palmer was mortally wounded.
There was an awful lot of blood loss. We had a pulse at that point, and which I was pleased about because I thought absolutely we can keep him alive.
Tobias Elwood MP, seen here kneeling next to PC Palmer, used his army medical training. Chest compressions, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in a desperate effort to keep him alive.
Eventually the doctor said, okay, I think we're just going to have to call it. And I remember looking at him and saying, you're going to have to tell me to stop, sir, because otherwise I'm going to keep doing this. And he just said, so you've done your best. We've all done our best here. I call the time of death. And I do recall the silence. The doctors and all the medics and the entire team then moved away with all their equipment. And I was left there with a couple of the original policemen who by this time were very, very upset because it was their colleague. It was very eerie to be able to hear the leaves, the trees and sounds that you're not normally familiar with at all, but not a single movement of traffic, not a horn, not anybody speaking, no shouts, nothing whatsoever. And to be in front of his body when everybody else then dispersed, and then it was up to us to, in a dignified way, cover the body up and then wait for the forensics to turn up, because of course this was now a murder scene.
Look here, from here, yeah.
Masood had murdered 5 people in an attack lasting 90 seconds. The first of a series of terrorist attacks that killed 36 people last spring. A year later, approaching the anniversary of the attacks, Newsnight has been investigating Khalid Masood and his connections to UK extremists, searching for clues that might help explain his murderous rampage. We have significant new information. There's a widely held belief that this was the work of one crazed individual, a so-called lone actor. While it's true that Masood was not part of a terrorist cell, he'd had contact with extremists and terrorists over the past 13 years. We started by looking at his links to drugs and violent crime. A source in Eastbourne, where he once lived, told us he was using crack cocaine in the 90s. He was dealing drugs and could be extremely violent. He'd already been convicted of stabbing a man in the face in 2000 in East Sussex, and later in another attack when he got out of prison, he stabbed his friend.
Full on punched me, stabbed me straight in the face, put me straight on the floor. I've turned around to trying to get up and he's trying to stab me in the back.
Most Islamic extremists that we've come across in the last 5 or 10 years have had a history of criminality. Most of them are criminals, and many of them have got a history of violence as well, and violent criminality.
Masood, then Adrian Ajao, is thought to have converted to Islam while in prison. Freed in 2003, he chose to live in a succession of places which have been extremism hotspots in the UK. They were all strongholds of the Islamist group I've investigated for nearly 20 years, Al-Muhajirun.
This is a prescribed organisation in this country, a prescribed terrorist organisation, but it takes root in certain parts and certain communities, and Khalid Masood was moving from one area to another where there was activity of Al-Muhajirun.
It was in Crawley in 2004 that he came on the security services radar for the first time. The town was at the centre of a plot using fertiliser stored here to make homemade bombs to blow up nightclubs and bars in the southeast. Masood's telephone number was in the contacts list of someone MI5 was investigating, but he was on the periphery and wasn't investigated. Does a detail in the public records provide a clue to his militant Islamist mindset back then? In 2004, Khalid Masood married his second wife, Farzana Malik, at this register office in Medway in Kent. I've got the certificate here, and the date on it is very interesting indeed. The marriage took place on the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on New York, the 11th of September 2004. We asked a former jihadist who infiltrated Al-Qaeda and spied on the group for Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, what he made of the choice of date.
Well, I mean, that is rather shocking and most likely speaks volumes of how he viewed that particular anniversary. So most likely he thought that it was a joyous day. He's not the only one. Unfortunately, there are legions of people who believe basically that it was a joyous day.
From 2005 to 2009, Masood spent time in Saudi Arabia teaching English, first in Yanbu, then at the government's aviation school in Jeddah. Eamon Dean knows some of his fellow students from those days.
Based on what the students who attended his classes, and now they are professionals in the aviation industry in Saudi Arabia, they describe someone who was more on the path of radicalism in a sense. He was serious. He wasn't someone who would describe the Saudi society as the true Islamic society. He would say that there are many things about the Saudi society that was wrong, especially the path they are taking in terms of modernity.
When he was living in Jeddah, British intelligence suspected Masood was helping extremists join Al-Qaeda in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. In London, MI5 later assessed Masood had been misidentified. They got the wrong man. Meanwhile, in Saudi, his students saw a man who was ultra-conservative.
They were worried basically that he was really more conservative Muslim than Saudi conservatives themselves. There was no question that he was a Salafist. He followed a strict line of Salafism when he was there, and he was influenced by the teachings that are prevalent in Saudi Arabia, but I think he went even beyond that.
On his return to the UK, he moved to Luton and taught English at a private language school called ELAS UK here at the Britannia Centre. At the time, ELAS UK was owned and run by trustees of the Luton Islamic Centre Mosque.
He'd just be like a normal teacher, a part-time teacher. I'd come there, do his lessons and disappear. A very pleasant person to talk to.
Luton Islamic Centre follows fundamentalist Salafi teachings, and so did Masood.
You're responsible for a lot of our brothers being beaten up. Yeah, you're responsible for the children being scared.
But the Imam has had street confrontations with Al-Muhajirun in the town and says if Masood had shown any signs of supporting the group, he'd have intervened.
If we had the slightest inclination that Khalid Masood was adopting such beliefs, we would have dealt with it on the spot. We wouldn't give it an opportunity to fester or grow.
Did Luton or the mosque or ELAS UK have anything to do with his radicalisation?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, if you look at the background where we come from and you study Luton Islamic Centre, we are at the forefront of refuting extremism.
But security sources have told Newsnight that Masood was associating with extremists in Luton. Once again, he was picked up on MI5's radar because he was in contact with these men who were convicted of plotting a terrorist attack on a territorial army base in the town. Masood lived just a few streets away from the plotters. At this point, MI5 still classified him as a subject of interest, but his file was closed in October 2012 because there was no evidence that he posed a direct threat to the UK.
He was coming in and out of, if you like, the surveillance that was going on at the time. It wouldn't mean that he was core and he was plotting as such, but he may well have had awareness of those who were plotting and certainly been cognizant of what was being planned or being talked about. He was well known, but prior to Westminster he'd never been a central figure in a conspiracy to carry out a terrorist attack.
The Muslims are over 2 billion around the world.
Between 2012 and 2016, Masood was in contact with al-Muhajiroon supporters who were being actively investigated by MI5, and he expressed support for 9/11. But MI5 has said that neither of these facts warranted reopening its investigation into him. In 2016, he was living in Birmingham with his third wife. Masood is believed to have been running a private tutoring business here. He joined an established Salafist community, but was already planning his next move, this time overseas to Saudi Arabia. In May 2016, we understand he was stopped from travelling to Jeddah to start a new job. Could this have been a trigger for the attack? Is this why he called his farewell document retaliation? New research suggests that denial of travel can be a key risk factor for terrorist attacks.
He was in touch with a transportation company in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia that specializes in transporting pilgrims who are visiting Mecca and Medina, the holy cities.
So why did the Saudi authorities refuse his work visa?
The understanding, and based on a confidential source here from Saudi Arabia, that his name was on a list provided, without saying who provided that list to the Saudis, but it was provided to them
by British intelligence, I would imagine.
Most likely it was provided by the authorities here.
A key question then for the police and MI5 is, was Saudi Arabia his end destination, or did Masood have an ambition to go to a jihadi theatre of war? Counter-terrorism sources told us they found no evidence he was trying to fight in Syria, but he had been linked to people trying to get to the Afghan border in the past.
If he was going to be more or less in the service of pilgrims coming into Mecca and Medina, that's not extremist. However, if he was using that as a pretext to go into Syria, then yes, that was extreme. So it all depends basically on what was his true intention, and we will never find out.
His visa was refused. Do you think this could be significant?
I think it is significant because I think that, like many of his kind, like many Islamist extremists, at some stage they often have an aspiration to travel to one of the or other theatres where jihadism is going on, whether that be the Fatah region of Pakistan, Afghanistan in the early 2000s, or more latterly to Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And it looks on the face of it that actually perhaps could have been the trigger for him. You know, if something is put in the way of the aspiration to go overseas, then they decide to carry out an attack here.
Research carried out by Canada's Secret Service CSIS after 2 attacks there lends weight to this theory. 100,000 intelligence reports were analysed, looking for factors that turn ideological extremists into violent attackers. It's called mobilisation to violence.
I'm proud to say that our work has been groundbreaking. We've got some fantastic analysts who have led the charge in this way. They've been inspired by the fact that we had the 2 attacks in Canada. We had never had attacks like that before, and they want to make sure that we were being as effective as possible. It was their contribution to it.
In October 2014, Martin Couture-Rilot deliberately mowed down soldiers in Quebec. 1 was killed. He'd had his passport seized 3 months before the attack. He was denied travel.
There can be a variety of factors that lead them to switch paths, but it is a fluid process that we see them switching back and forth. So it's not a surprise, for example, that we would see them go from a denial of travel, where travel was the objective, to subsequently plotting an attack.
This was so-called Islamic State's chief propagandist, al-Adnani. He released a video in 2014 telling his supporters explicitly that if you can't get to the caliphate, then attack at home with knives and cars. That's what Masood did. From his family home in this well-kept suburban estate in Birmingham, he started downloading extremist material in 2016, researching Daesh, so-called Islamic State, and planning to travel. It's now believed he started to plan the Westminster Bridge terrorist attack from here. In the months before the attack, he told his family he was planning to move abroad for a second time. Newsnight understands that the police investigation after the attack found he was on the verge of travelling overseas with another man. We don't know to where. I also understand that the police investigation suspected Masood was radicalising a third man by giving him religious instruction. It seems he was making final preparations for the attack, and in December 2016 he moved into this small bedsit in Hagley Road, central Birmingham. We spoke to a former flatmate.
He was a different person, I can see that, because of his clothing, his beard, his style was different. He was wearing always a cloth that is just one piece from his shoulders to his feet. But I didn't scare of him.
You weren't scared?
No, because as I say, he was very calm. He was minding his own business. And my impression of him was he was more like a spiritual guy.
On the 22nd of March, he thought Khalid Masood was in his room when the police raided hours after the attack.
I saw a couple of police cars. I went to stairs and I saw fully armored police officers.
How many roughly?
Just on the stairs there were 4 or 5 of them. But
with
there were
body armour, guns?
With fully equipped, with all the body armors and with machine guns, with the green lasers pointing at me. It was like I was in the movie.
Must have been a massive shock to find out.
Yes. I was in shock when I found out that the guy living next to me murdered innocent people.
The police and MI5 were racing to find out if Masood was part of a wider cell or if he'd acted alone. 12 people were arrested, though all were later released without charge. Ultimately, the police and MI5 concluded that Masood acted alone. But this was not a random attack by any means. Newsnight has charted his long-standing connections to extremism. What triggered him to strike at Westminster Bridge? Did he blame the British state for disrupting his travel plans? It's hard to get inside the head of such a violent and volatile man, and counter-terrorism experts argue his precise motivations died with him.